Test, test, test. Test. Test, test. Test, test.
Ready to do this? We got enough here, right? The Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing without objection so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions without objection so ordered. As a reminder, if members wish to insert a document into the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. I now recognize myself for the purpose of opening statement for 5 minutes. Today's hearing will discuss the state of intercity passenger rail with a focus on how to develop this mode in a way that is safe, efficient, cost-effective, and that meets the demands of consumers. Investments and innovation in our rail infrastructure are essential to building a robust and competitive American transportation system. We must ensure that federal policies and spending are balanced with a realistic analysis of consumer demand for passenger rail and best use of taxpayers' dollars. There is no better example, not a better example of completely ignoring these important considerations than the high-speed California Rail project originally proposed to run between Los Angeles and San Francisco. The venture, once estimated to cost at $33 billion and to be completed in 2020, is now projected to cost over $128 billion and counting, with an estimated completion date still over a decade away, with no solid path forward. The project has been plagued by a failure to account for actual costs and work associated with obtaining land to build the track, eminent domain issues, environmental concerns, permitting red tape, and whether low consumer demand will require permanent and costly government subsidies to operate the line. While the California High-Speed Rail project shows the failures of poor planning and government incompetence, there are promising opportunities to promote intercity rail passenger responsibly, encouraging competition, removing these burdensome government obstacles, focusing on areas of high demand, and involving private sector have proven effective ways of managing intercity passenger rail. And today we will hear from witnesses about those promising efforts. I look forward to discussing both the challenges and the opportunities for intercity passenger rail, as well as how Congress can provide robust oversight and safeguard taxpayer dollars that support these projects. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses. Thank you all for being here today. I'll yield back the balance of my time. I will now recognize our ranking member Payne for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Nels, Chairman Graves, and Ranking Member Larson, and our 4 witnesses for being with us today. Intercity passenger rail is on the brink of transformation thanks to the $100 billion in funding for rail projects in the bipartisan infrastructure law. Over $4.6 billion is soon to be awarded across the nation through the FRA programs, including federal state partnerships for intercity passenger rail grants and the eagerly awaited Corridor ID program with 92 proposals from 33 states under consideration. Announcements for awards are expected by end of year end. Earlier this month, the FRA awarded over $16 billion in funding for projects along the Northeast Corridor, including funding for the Gateway program. Almost $4.5 billion of that funding would directly impact my constituents in New Jersey's 10th congressional district. This influx of funding for intercity passenger rail projects would not be possible without the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was passed by this chamber and signed into law by President Biden this month 2 years ago. This funding is already enabling Amtrak and local governments to focus on sustainable, long-term projects rather than short-term patches. While project funding is crucial, it is equally vital to secure operational and network maintenance funding. It was unfortunate to see a majority of my colleagues across the aisle either vote to cut funding to rail programs by 57% or completely axe funding for Amtrak's national network as we consider the fiscal 2024 Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Bill earlier this month. The bill was already flawed with a 64% cut in funding to Amtrak, including a 35% cut to the national network and a staggering 92% cut to the Northeast Corridor. And these funding levels were adopted, Amtrak would likely significantly cut service across the national network, disconnecting passengers in both rural and urban communities who are reliant on Amtrak to go visit family, travel for work, or attend an event in another city. The bill also eradicates funding for crucial programs like the federal-state partnership for intercity passenger rail grants, vital for capital improvements and establishing new routes. And if those cuts weren't enough, the bill also had a 50% cut in funding to the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Program, which is used to fund safety improvement projects for both intercity rail and freight rail projects. Fortunately, these drastic cuts were too severe to pass the House, allowing the Senate to pursue a more balanced bill aligned with the success of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Mr. Chairman, while I am glad to see your interest in intercity passenger rail, and I'm thrilled that we have had multiple hearings on this issue this Congress, I want to note that today marks the 300th day since the Norfolk Southern derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, and this subcommittee has yet to have a hearing on freight rail safety. We've had a representative from the CSX Freight Railroad in this room to talk about passenger rail, but not to talk about how a small town in Kentucky was evacuated last week due to a CSX derailment involving molten sulfur. Instead of being at home to celebrate Thanksgiving with family, these families were forced to spend part of their day in a middle school gymnasium. There is a freight rail derailment practically every day in this country, and every day we go without addressing this issue. Here in Congress is another day communities across the country are at risk from a preventable catastrophe. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses how the $100 billion in funding for rail projects in the bipartisan infrastructure law will benefit our nation's communities. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I would also like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for being here today. And briefly, I'd like to take a moment and explain our lighting system for our witnesses. There are 3 lights in front of you. Green means go, yellow means that you're running out of time, and red means to conclude your marks. I ask you to respect that. I ask unanimous consent that the witnesses' full statements be included into the record without objection so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing without objection so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included into the record of today's hearing without objection so ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to the 5 minutes. With that, Mr. Daly. Mr. Daly, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Yes, sir. Good morning, Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Payne, and members of the Rail Subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I am Andy Daly, Senior Director of Passenger Operations at CSX and a 4th-generation railroader. I have been with CSX for 23 years. For the past 6 years, I have served as Senior Director of Passenger Operations. As part of my duties, I serve as the point person for all performance and contractual relationships with our passenger operation partners across CSX's 20,000-mile network. Like other Class I railroads, CSX operates almost exclusively on infrastructure we own, build, and maintain. About 40 cents of every dollar earned in the railroad industry goes back to the upkeep of our railroads, making us one of the most capital-intensive industries in the nation. Despite this challenge, the American Society of Civil Engineers gives rail infrastructure the highest grade for our infrastructure conditions as compared to all other U.S. transportation modes. Over the last 5 years, CSX has invested $10 billion into our network, with $2.3 billion in 2023 alone. When working with Amtrak or other passenger rail operators, CSX endeavors to create a safe, well-planned, cost-effective, and transparent partnership. CSX runs 5.5 million train miles on CSX per year, which is a quarter of Amtrak's train miles in the United States. On average, 60 Amtrak trains operate on our tracks daily. The volume of Amtrak trains, along with 159 trains operated by our commuter rail partners like VRE, MARC, and MBTA, makes CSX among the most passenger-intensive freight railroads in the United States. Thanks to the hard work of many at CSX, we've achieved the best contract on-time performance in our history of hosting Amtrak in 2022. We closed out the year with 94.8% on-time performance, which was a 2% improvement over the prior year. CSX looks at 4 pillars when discussing passenger rail expansion or new opportunities. Number 1, safety. The addition of new passenger service cannot impact the safety of our customers, employees, existing passenger commuter service, or surrounding communities. Number 2, capacity. There must be adequate capacity to meet our current and future customer needs. Number 3, compensation. CSX must be fairly compensated for the use of our infrastructure as well as maintenance costs. And 4, liability. CSX cannot take on additional liability when additional passenger services are brought onto our network. These 4 pillars are critical to the health of our nation's supply chain and the safety of our communities. CSX's recent transaction with the Commonwealth of Virginia is an example of how strong adherence to these pillars can pave the way for introduction of enhanced passenger operations. The series of construction projects included in the transaction are currently underway between Washington and Richmond. This project is a result of a tremendous amount of effort by Virginia, CSX, and Amtrak, and will result in significant expansion of VRE and Amtrak services while also preserving our ability to meet current and future freight demand. Importantly, it shows that demand for both freight and passenger rail service can be respected and protected when the parties work together in an open and honest format. In 2021, CSX acquired Pan Am Railroad operated through New England. CSX is working with the Northern New England Passenger Rail Authority on several projects that will improve both the reliability and pave the way for an increase in Downeaster service. We are also in ongoing planning with the Massachusetts Department of Transportation and pursuing a thoughtful way to expand passenger rail operations in the Commonwealth between Boston and Springfield. On behalf of our President and CEO, Joe Hendricks, and those of us in leadership at CSX, we want to emphasize with the members of the committee that our company initiative called One CSX prioritizes teamwork across all levels, all departments, and all locations. The transformative shift in our workplace culture is foundational to the way we work together, operating as one team where employees feel valued, included, appreciated, and are able to contribute to our business objectives to safely and reliably serve our customers. We are optimistic about our ability to partner with passenger rail operators where it makes sense and where we can plan ahead. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you, Mr. Daly. Ms. Mortensen, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Payne, and the members of this esteemed subcommittee. My name is Stacy Mortensen. I serve as the executive director of 2 different agencies. One oversees the San Joaquin Intercity service operated by Amtrak. The other oversees the ACE commuter rail service to the Bay Area operated by Herzog Transit Services. Both of these are in the major Northern California area. Through this experience, I'm asking you today to consider thinking about different angles and different ways of state-supported Amtrak services. In the new vision for passenger rail service that the chairman and vice chairman talked about, a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work. So let me begin first by thanking quickly several of our local representatives who take care of our service region, Congress members Duarte, DeSaulnier, and LaMalfa. California funds 3 of the largest intercity passenger rail service operated by Amtrak. These 3 routes carried over 3.2 million riders last year post-COVID, and that accounted for about 40% of the nation's state-supported trips. 11 years ago, California passed a bill giving one of our agencies the responsibility to protect and improve the service for the San Joaquin corridor and the riders. It costs nearly $100 million per year and covers almost 400 miles. And the service also includes connecting throughway bus, one of the biggest in the country, to give access to residents who aren't right near the rail line. This service has proven critical to a very challenging demographic within the San Joaquin corridor. Passenger household incomes are some of the lowest in the country, and yet a majority of those passengers continued to ride during the COVID pandemic shutdown when trains were limited. It proved to us over time this was the only option these people had. And San Joaquins have recovered probably one of the best of all services under Amtrak operation. 25 years ago, I was also part of the startup of the ACE commuter rail service and experienced more of a bootstrap method for getting rail service implemented using local and county revenues and a very competitive process. Herzog is our operator and has been our operator on that service for 25 years. One of the few things that San Joaquins and ACE trains share in common is we operate on the Class I freight railroads. We've learned over this time that to be successful with these partners, we need to understand the freight business goals. We need to commit to funding capacity improvements that move both freight and passenger trains. And we need to learn to coexist. And I think that's important in this new vision for additional rail. Our host rail lines, Union Pacific and BNSF, they've been consistent allies with us in our planning process for more service. But a key factor in maintaining those relationships has been another shared aspect between the two services, and that is collaborative governance. While each agency I represent has its own elected board with its own constituents, each governing board agrees to assume the roles that they're strongest at, to avoid duplication, play to their strengths, streamline decisions, and respond quickly to changing conditions that we see. They delegate decision-making to each other, which is a little bit rare, but it makes the most sense. And I think the railroads appreciate this approach because it recognizes that accommodating passenger rail service on their lines can be difficult, and we work in good faith to accomplish those goals. But at the national level, there are processes and legislation that can set back those hard-earned gains. Sometimes expansion efforts, especially nationalized, are plagued with long delivery times. Centralized decision-making often means those who are ready have to wait for those who are not. These national processes and changes to those processes are geared towards national expediency, which sometimes Congress does ask Amtrak to achieve, but it comes at the cost of protecting and improving the services for the passengers that rely on them. These people who truly pay for the service, they don't understand the labyrinths that we have to go through to make improvements and add trains. They just want to get on board. They just want to take their trip. We do, however, have a few bright spots. We have some new models emerging that I hope you take into account. They're through discussions with Amtrak, host railroads, FRA, and the state. And it figures out a way to right-size the roles. It plays to the strengths of each of the parties. Who can do what best, who can do what most efficiently, and who can reach down to the constituents who ride the trains and make sure their input is incorporated. I'm asking the members of this subcommittee to be supportive of a new and improved effort. I hope the advocacy will lead to the option to customize appropriate paths forward for each unique situation or region, something that's a little impossible today. Honestly, right-sizing today will allow us to get it right tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mortensen. I now recognize Dr. Ohanian. Am I saying that correct? Ohanian? You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Chair Nels, Ranking Member Payne, committee members, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I'm Leo Ohanian. I'm a professor of economics at UCLA and a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. High-speed rail, which I'll refer to as HSR, poses challenges regarding costs and project delays. My comments today will focus on addressing these problems, drawing on lessons from California's HSR experience. I'll frame my testimony around 4 issues. 1, understanding the large risks and uncertainties accompanying these projects. 2, the value of third-party evaluations to provide independent assessments. 3, reducing HSR construction costs. And 4, the promise of private sector HSR. As a Californian, I wish I could tell you we've made significant HSR progress. We haven't. The project is extremely delayed, and its 2008 budget has increased by a factor of 4 to about $128 billion. Some of this reflects mistakes in management and accountability, but it also reflects the failure to identify and mitigate the risks and uncertainties with projects of this size. This failure dates back to 2008 when California's nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office reviewed California's HSR business plan and found it lacking in the following areas: failure to describe how funding would be secured, failure to describe how costs would be allocated, failure to provide a break-even point, failure to present the methods used to forecast ridership, failure to provide environmental review completion dates, and failure to describe how these and other risks would be mitigated. Put differently, California HSR began its life with $10 billion in voter-approved bond funding, but without a legitimate business plan. The legislative analysts were prescient, as the deficiencies that they identified have negatively impacted HSR from its beginning. California's rail authority should have focused on identifying risks and their mitigations and should have been more forthcoming about these issues. The project is now roughly 20 years behind schedule, and its budget has ballooned from about $33 billion to about $128 billion. The lessons from California are clear. Projects should provide a comprehensive and detailed business plan that itemizes all identifiable risks, that provide cost-effective, doable mitigations, and that build in a sizable cost buffer to address the unforeseen problems that frequently occur in such large capital investments. Acknowledging risk also means using a higher discount rate for the purpose of cost-benefit analyses, which are the foundation of capital investment project evaluation. California's HSR benefit cost study uses a 7% discount rate. In my opinion, this discount rate is too low given the project's risky history and given our current interest rate environment. The second recommendation is using third-party evaluations of HSR proposals. The state's Legislative Analyst's Office was not alone in identifying California's HSR deficiencies. Others include the Reason Foundation and the Cato Institute. Both expressed concerns about ridership forecasted levels and forecasted costs, both of which they viewed as unrealistic. These concerns were dismissed, however. If they'd been heard, I suspect we could have managed HSR in California more effectively. Third-party analyses are equally valuable today as California builds a $35 billion, 171-mile segment between Bakersfield and Merced in California's Central Valley. The Rail Authority projects this segment will reduce state driving only by about 1/20% by 2030. These statistics raise concerns. Utilizing third-party assessments by disinterested experts would be value in evaluating the viability of California HSR and other projects. California's high construction costs, now over $200 million per mile, highlight the problem of U.S. railway costs more broadly. Some recent European HSR projects cost about half as much. Our high costs were acknowledged by Secretary Buttigieg 2 years ago, but the causes of our high costs remain unknown. Some evidence points to lengthy and costly environmental reviews that significantly delay U.S. projects. We need to prioritize bringing construction costs down so that our projects are economical and conserve federal funding. My fourth point is about building private sector HSR. Brightline Holdings is set to build a 228 HSR route between Southern California and Las Vegas. Despite being 50 miles longer than the state's Bakersfield-Merced segment, Brightline's projected $12 billion cost represents a 64% savings compared to California HSR, and Brightline's expected completion is just 4 years away. Private sector HSR is incentivized to find routes where there is substantial demand, which is what we all want, and they're also incentivized to build efficiently, which is what we all want. This suggests significant potential for private-public HSR partnerships. I hope this testimony is informative, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. I now recognize Austin Mayor Watson. Thank you for being here from the great state of Texas. Welcome, welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. As indicated, my name is Kirk Watson. I'm the Mayor of Austin, Texas, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify here today and provide the perspective of a local elected official on this important issue. My written testimony goes into significant detail about several items related to intercity passenger rail, including support for the significant investment made by the IIJA and Amtrak's plans for using that funding. So I'm going to focus my oral testimony on our local view and the value that could be obtained. At the broadest level, I'm eager to do anything I can to support improved intercity passenger rail in Texas. Texas and its cities are leading the nation in growth, and we desperately need to improve multimodal mobility between our cities and metropolitan areas that are the bedrock of our state's thriving economy. When Austin's tiny Amtrak station was built in 1947, Austin's population was just over 100,000. Today, our population is nearly 10 times that amount, making Austin the 10th largest city in America. Austin has been the fastest growing metropolitan area since 2010. The metropolitan area population now exceeds 2.4 million people. And of course, other Texas cities and metropolitan areas are experiencing similarly robust growth. Austin is planning a multi-billion-dollar investment in our rapidly growing airport, in transit, in roadway improvements, and the Texas Department of Transportation and other Texas local governments are investing tens of billions of dollars more on highways, local roads, and transit. However, the highways and airports connecting Texas cities simply can't keep up with the demands of our state's economy and the mobility needs of its people. And so I'm glad that federal agencies and Amtrak and TxDOT and Texas cities and counties are looking to improve intercity passenger rail service in Texas, and more specifically in what we call the Texas Triangle. The three transportation corridors in Texas that are anchored by Dallas-Fort Worth, Houston, and San Antonio are often referred to as the Texas Triangle. The cities and metropolitan areas of the Triangle are home to 21 million people, account for 70% of all Texans, and 74.2% of the Texas economy. It's experiencing rapid population growth, accounting for 88% of Texas's population growth between 2010 and 2020. Austin is located along the western leg of the triangle that links San Antonio, Austin, Fort Worth, and Dallas. Those four cities along the 310-mile western leg are all four of them, among the 13 largest cities in the United States, with an additional 800,000 people living along that leg in the Waco and Killeen Temple area. By contrast, only 2 of the 13 largest U.S. cities, New York City and Philadelphia, are located along the Boston to Washington Northeast Corridor. I would argue that the Texas Triangle is the lowest hanging fruit in the nation for improving intercity passenger rail service. Projections show that the developing passenger rail service in that triangle will produce robust ridership with a relatively modest capital investment because of the population, the density of that population, the economy, and the demographics. For example, the San Antonio to Dallas-Fort Worth corridor has all of the attributes that you would think would apply to the demand for passenger rail service. 4 major metropolitan areas with rapidly growing populations, severe highway congestion, and travel distances that are really too short to fly, and an often unpleasantly long drive. Think about these numbers. Dallas-Fort Worth to San Antonio is 310 rail miles. San Antonio to Houston is 210 rail miles. Houston back up to Dallas-Fort Worth is 297 rail miles. There's only one rail trip to Austin, Texas from Dallas, and that's the Texas Eagle, and it takes 6.5 hours, and that's if it's on time when it leaves. And believe it or not, there's even less passenger rail service on the other 2 legs of the triangle. Developing the intercity passenger rail service for the Texas Triangle is going to require cooperation and financial support at all levels of government, federal, state, and local. And I'm pleased that TxDOT and other Texas leaders are seizing that opportunity. I fully support TxDOT's recent application under the Federal Railroad Administration's Corridor Identification and Development Plan to lay the groundwork for improved intercity passenger rail on the Texas Triangle. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, thank you all very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about the value I think that could be obtained.
Thank you, Mayor Watson. Thank you all four, for your testimony. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from Ian Jeffries, President and CEO of the Association of American Railroads, dated November 29th, 2023. Without objection, so ordered. We will now turn to questions for the panel. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Ohian. The Biden administration's aspirations for high-speed rail fail to account for several realities, including a lack of customer demand, economic viability, and the impact on existing rail infrastructure. So how can Congress best safeguard taxpayer dollars when considering support for high-speed rail and other projects discussed today?
Chairman, important question and multi-parts to that. To conserve federal funding, we should prioritize projects on the basis of the amount of return that they can deliver to Americans. My testimony tried to provide sort of a four-step process that could be a blueprint for evaluating these types of projects and where they've gone wrong in the past, particularly in California. The business plan has to be detailed, and it really has to bring into account costs and risks. And fundamentally, what I see from where I sit as an academic is just the riskiness of these projects have just been so avoided. And that's something that really, I think, is to the detriment of us as Americans.
And in your testimony, you talk a little bit about Brightline from that. Is it the Vegas to California, and how that private-public partnership and how Brightline can do it for less cost? Explain that.
Yes. So Brightline is building a 228-mile route from Southern California to Las Vegas at a projected cost of nearly 2/3 less than California high-speed rail project. So that's very striking because it shows that it can be done much more economically, and it can be done much more economically when the right incentives are in place, which is, of course, what happens with the private sector. So I think when it comes to high-speed rail, we have to really temper the idea of finding the routes and segments where there's sufficient demand and finding routes where there's relatively few risks and where we can build it at a reasonable cost.
If the California high-speed rail project was initiated as a true public-private partnership where the private sector would assume more of the financial risk in the construction and operating of that system, how different would things look today if the California high-speed rail?
Well, I suspect it would be very different. In the private sector, one can't imagine not delivering revenue for 15 years and going over budget by a factor of 4. It just boggles the mind.
In your testimony, it talks about that plan, the rail plan for California high-speed rail, and that was legally required, and the plan wasn't out there, and then it went to the bond, and the voters voted on it. Did anybody go to jail for that?
I do not know.
To me, they misled the voters.
In my opinion, yes.
At the least, yes. Thank you again for being here. Ms. Mortensen, Texas is considering the development of high-speed passenger rail service between Dallas and Houston. What lessons can Texas and federal policymakers learn from California's high-speed rail experience?
Well, I think in the event we're working on Class 1 rail lines, I think a lot of cooperation up front and a real business understanding of what the risks will be. When we use someone else's right-of-way, we need to partner and we need to respect that they have rights and assets that they've built over time. Where we're building outside of that right-of-way, I think really understanding the risk that is involved in right-of-way and the optics of purchasing right-of-way that might sit for a long period of time and may disrupt family industries that have been around for generations. And so I think some of those risks may not have been at the forefront, but those kind of things do need to be thought about up front and really mitigated before the process starts.
Mayor Watson, I'm on the record supporting high-speed rail. I like the idea of that rail line between Houston and Dallas. I see the congestion on 45 and everything else. How do you feel about that project, and what do you know about that project?
Well, I don't know as much as maybe I should know about it, but what I do know is that I like the idea of when you don't have anything in terms of rail going between Dallas, that Metroplex, and Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex and the Houston area Metroplex, which are the fourth and fifth largest Metroplexes in the country. We need to have more there. I also like the idea that there may be some competition, I think that's a good thing, but I agree that what's going to be required is upfront collaboration, upfront recognizing the risk and analyzing those completely so that people go into it trying to mitigate those risks as opposed to learning about that after they start. I think the opportunity that Amtrak also provides as part of that is one that we ought to clearly look at because of what could be done perhaps more rapidly.
Thank you. My time has expired. I now recognize Ranking Member Payne for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Niels. I would like to ask unanimous consent to submit a letter from the States for Passenger Rail Coalition addressed to the House and Senate Appropriations, expressing deep concern regarding the cuts proposed in the House's fiscal 2024 THUD appropriations bill and the drastic impact these cuts would have on short-distance intercity rail.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Watson, once again, thank you for being here. And I recently seen articles about how the growth both in Austin and San Antonio could lead to a mega metro of sorts. How would an increase in intercity passenger rail between these two cities impact the quality of life for the residents in your region?
Well, I appreciate that question. I would say two things. First of all, for those that don't know, Austin and San Antonio are only roughly 100 to 110 miles apart from each other. And the only really straight way to do it, to get there, back and forth, is Interstate 35, which is the only interstate highway that runs through Austin and San Antonio, and it's very congested. That being said, I'll give two quick examples. One is that we know that workforce goes back and forth between our two cities. Both of those thriving economies of Austin and San Antonio, they rely upon each other for workforce. The numbers that we have indicate that about 20,000 people leave Bexar County every morning and go to Travis County, which is Austin, and about 28,000 go the other direction and work. So in terms of work and careers and the quality of life of people, it would make a difference.
Excellent. In your interactions with mayors from smaller cities such as Temple and College Station, have they expressed support for increased intercity passenger rail?
Yes, in fact, we, during the National Association of Counties convention in Austin, we convened a group of locally elected officials to talk about passenger rail, and there is a lot of support because of the difference they see in making it for their people.
And how would these smaller communities benefit from increased service?
Well, first of all, people can live in those small communities and maybe work in other places. They also can have quality of life issues in that they may be able to attend and go to different things. But the other part that I would indicate is it ties our state and our country together, which is one of the really great roles of the federal government, is making the kinds of investments that keep us bound together and tie us together.
Thank you. Mr. Daly, thanks for being here today. The FRA program, the confidential close call reporting system modeled after successful FAA initiative, it allows rail workers to confidentially report near misses, improving the safety of the industry as a whole. Do you believe a program such as this could improve both intercity passenger and freight rail in terms of safety?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, CSX has drafted our own confidential close call reporting MOU. We've shared that with SMART and BLET and have a meeting set up here hopefully within the next month with the FRA also included in that discussion. to see if that's something that we can advance forward, independent of the broader Class 1 AAR contingency. Unfortunately, that's about the extent of this, of my knowledge of this. I can definitely have one of my colleagues that's more well-versed in this matter get with you after the hearing.
Okay, thank you. I would be glad to hear what is the holdup with CSX joining this program. Chairman Nels, I would like to ask unanimous consent to submit a letter from the Association of American Railroads dated March 2nd, 2023 into the record.
Without objection.
In this letter, all Class 1 railroads commit to joining the department's confidential close call reporting system. Mr. Daly, how has the historic funding for rail allowed for improvements to CSX's network?
I'm sorry, I couldn't catch the last part of that question.
How has the historic funding for rail allowed for improvements to CSX's network?
Yes, absolutely. We've partnered with many states and different entities that applied for various grants, signed on letters of support, and looking forward to those, coming through the process and coming to fruition to benefit us. CSX ourselves is not able to be a direct beneficiary or applicant for any of these awards, so we partner with other interested parties and support their applications.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will yield back.
Thank you, sir. I now recognize Mr. Babin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses here as well. Appreciate it. Just some little aside reasons and maybe reasons to build, to not build high-speed rails. The COVID pandemic changed a lot for our country, and unfortunately, a lot of these changes appear to be here to stay. And commuter rails have certainly appeared to be a very popular way to get from home to work in many urban and suburban parts of our nation. However, according to the U.S. Census, the number of people working remotely has now more than tripled during the COVID pandemic. And while some businesses and employers are now bringing employees back into the office, many pundits seem to think that as technology develops, more and more folks will skip the office and work remotely. And while I personally take issue with with that for some sectors, look at Washington, D.C., where federal employees are still at home, many in their sweatpants instead of coming to the office and doing their jobs. And I leave it up to the individual businesses to do what works best for them. But when it comes to publicly funded transit, however, I do take issue with putting the American taxpayer on the hook for expensive transit projects that may become a highly funded relic in just a few short years if we were working more and more from home. To clarify, I'm talking about commuter rails that are supposed to get folks to and from work, and this question is for anyone who really would like to respond on the panel. Please give us your thoughts about the data that you've seen on commuter rail utilization in the telework era, or a thought on how future of work mixes with the future of transit. Who would like to take a stab at that?
Well, Mr. Congressman, your point about remote work is very prescient. Your concerns, I think, are very reasonable. Right now, about 30% of U.S. workers are engaged in some type of remote work. Is projected by some economists to rise to 40%. In my state of California, 34% of workers are working at some point remotely. 1 in 4 are working full-time remotely. So that's very significant, and that obviously has important implications for transit and for congestion and for general commuter paths.
Thank you very much. And I've got another question. I want to say welcome, Mayor Watson. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
As a Texan and a former student at UT, Austin's a great town with a lot of fond memories in my heart and mind. The Texas high-speed rail efforts have certainly changed a lot over the last 35 years. since the former Texas Lieutenant Governor with a handful of lobbyists and investors first tried to make this happen in the late 80s. Since then, we've seen various iterations of the project come and go with foreign investors and as well as Americans. We've seen the project renamed, new maps, a whole lot of change with who is pushing this project. And while this project was once declared to be, this is something concerning to me, to be 100% privately funded, it now appears that many of these proposals, in fact, most of them, are now asking for taxpayer funding for the projects. And you've been in government for about 30 years, Mayor, as a state senator and other, you've worn lots of hats, which is long enough to cover the entire lifespan of the California high-speed rail. So I was going to ask you to please tell us what lessons you've learned watching and observing California's challenges with their high-speed rail project and how those lessons are being applied to what's happening in Texas. And then tell me why you think that the current high-speed rail effort in Texas is different from former attempts.
Well, as you know, I've left the Senate back in 2020, and so I haven't been in the Senate for a while, so I've not followed closely all that's going on right now with the high-speed rail plan, but there are a couple of lessons that we know ought to be learned. One is, we've talked a little bit about them here today. One is what mistakes were made on the front end that aren't being taken into account as you move forward on this, including potential risk. The other is that we need to recognize that pretty much all systems worldwide, when you're talking about rail, all systems worldwide, even the very successful ones, they end up needing some sort of public help in much the same way that we deal with our roadways and our airports as other transportation. So I don't think that we should rule out high-speed rail because it has not met some people's expectations in other places. We can learn from those mistakes, and I think we ought to look at ways that we make sure it works well, even if it requires supplement.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'm out of time, so I'll yield back, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Mr. Babin. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for this hearing. It's a great hearing. I think one of the first lessons that as members of Congress we should learn is anyone comes to our office and says that this rail line, this system is going to be 100% privately funded, we should just tell them to stop and start over because they're wrong and they're either they were mistaken or not telling you the truth. In the 2000s, when there was an attempt to privatize Amtrak, it was only going to be privatized by giving all the taxpayer money that we currently give to Amtrak to a private entity in order to do it. So that's not actually privatizing Amtrak either. There's always going to be this mix of private and public. That said, I do think that because of the BIL, it's being created the opportunities to actually do partnerships, true partnerships with the private sector in providing rail lines. And we should embrace that along with Amtrak. There's not it shouldn't be a conflict there at all here on the committee for that. And with that, Mr. Ohanian, I wanted to ask you, because this is a little bit new for us, a little bit, I want to be sure we're comparing apples to apples and apples to oranges, and that when it comes to Bright Lines, LA to Las Vegas, which is a great idea and great concept, right now, you said that they have the projections, but they haven't built anything, so if that goes $1 over the projection, should we be angry and upset with that or not? Like how should we judge the success of a private-public effort versus just a singular public effort on rail? How should we assess the value of that $1 being used? Have you thought through that?
Thank you. Well, I think one metric would be on the basis of construction costs. Another metric would be on the basis...
You mean comparing like a per mile cost, for instance?
Yes, per mile costs.
Per mile cost.
Another metric would be on operating costs. We're not there yet, obviously, with Bright Line.
Nowhere near, right.
But that would be another metric. Another metric would be in terms of successfully identifying passenger demand. So is it a route that people really highly value? Is ridership intensity higher, load factors high? So that would be another metric to judge. And so delays, costs, construction costs, operating costs, are you serving a large market? I think those are all reasonable metrics in which you can use to evaluate any segment put together by any operator, whether it's public, private-public partnership.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thanks. Mayor, good to see you again. We were in Austin earlier this year. We had a chance to talk about a lot of things, I-35, and reconnecting communities and local transit efforts, as well as rail. And one of the things with all the infrastructure investment you're doing in Austin, around the Austin area, one of the issues that you all brought up was workforce, the availability of the workforce. And can you help us understand, maybe specific to passenger rail development or anything else, frankly, how you have come along since we talked last in terms of ensuring not the number of jobs created for the operating side, but how you're developing the workforce to be able to do this work. It's an issue that we have all over the country, frankly, no matter what we're building.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, and also thank you for the time you spent in Austin. Couple of things. We have about $20 to $25 billion worth of infrastructure projects related to mobility that are in play right now. One is a voter-approved rail system. One is the airport, Interstate 35, and working with TxDOT on Interstate 35 and multiple others. What we've done is we've actually done studies to determine, do we have the workforce available to do all of that work? And we've determined that we're going to need to dramatically increase the number of people we put into career paths to do that. So we've already begun the process of creating what's going to be a mobility and infrastructure workforce academy, so that what we're doing is focusing as early as maybe late middle school and high school to get people into career paths. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I was here in Washington, D.C., looking at an infrastructure academy so that we could replicate the good parts of that and make it a difference. So we have made it a focus. I've visited with the mayor of San Antonio to see if we can do parallel things so that we don't cannibalize each other on this, and we actually put more people into the career path.
Yeah, that's, I think, an important point, a lesson we're learning through BIL implementation in every mode of transportation. So appreciate that. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. LaMalfa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this hearing and your expertise you brought to it. It's going to be, for my colleague from the Bay Area, Mrs. Selny, like a deja vu all over again, right, sir? Anyway, see you, pal. So we've heard a lot already about the California high-speed rail. I call it high-cost rail, and we'll go into more, but jumping from a price tag the voters were shown back in 2008 of $33 billion to only 1 year later, $42 billion with a new estimate. Then when I was in the state Senate there, it went up to 98.5 only 3 years later in a 2011 hearing we had. And now we see 128 and skyrocketing, 128 billion. So they're projecting every mile will cost $200 million for 1 mile. You know, a good track runner can do that in 4 minutes. So yet this is taking many, many years. So I'd like to ask Mrs. Mortensen, at some point, it seems like it's just an inexcusable waste of money for people, especially with other projects in California, our crumbling roads. You know, you ought to see the right lane on I-5 for a good part of my district, the water storage we need in the state, so many other infrastructure things we could be doing. I put it this way, if you were sold, you know, instead of 33 billion, let's say you had a bid on re-roofing your house for 33,000, and then they come back when they show up to do the work, oh, that's gone up from 33 to now 128,000. Wouldn't you be looking for a new bid? Wouldn't you be looking at, maybe I would like to do this over again? I actually attempted that with a bill when I was in the state Senate to put it back on the ballot when we see the price had tripled. Didn't get very far, but at least we got the point out. Mrs. Mortensen, at what point do we cut this burning boat loose?
Well, thank you for the question. And it's a tough one, especially being in California, being a constituent, being in the area that could be served. So I have straddled various positions on this issue. I think we're overseeing what for us is a large program. And given this current bid environment, we're experiencing things many industries are. And we've had to take a step back and think about, can we deliver everything that we had planned pre-COVID when the estimates were done? So I think at some point, a step has to be taken backward. I know there's extreme pressure on the High-Speed Rail Authority to keep moving forward, to keep solving the problems, to keep finding the money. But I think taking a step and assessing what can really be done that has the benefit.
Well, we recall, though, that the original $9 billion was supposed to be supplemented by private sector money coming in and investing in it, like Brightline, where you talked about today. That private money is not to be found. They're running away from this project.
It is
And of course,
not, and that-
subsidies are disallowed for the ticket price, too, so go ahead.
So as members have mentioned here about the risk, contractors, because their livelihood depends on it, are very keenly looking at where they will take risk. And they will take it, as you see with Brightline. But I think that opportunity in the high-speed rail program was not fully vetted at the right time to let contractors come in at the right time, so they haven't.
Maybe
And I
jump to
think
Dr.
that's a
Ohanian
flaw.
on that. It's a great point, because the initial business plan that the voters would have seen some part of in 2008 really didn't, obviously, as only a year later, it jumped from 33 to 42 billion. They didn't even have a plan for where the route was going to be, including the all-important boring through the Grapevine, if that's what they decide to do. How are they even going to get over the top from the Bakersfield area into Los Angeles? Is there any idea? What does the plan look like for the route, and as well as the money?
I don't know the details of the route at this point, but
I don't think they do either.
I think, the project remains, it was obviously risky in 2008. The project remains risky today for some of the same reasons it was 15 years ago and for some new reasons, including, the important reason to your stewards of federal funding. There's enormous backlog of transportation and infrastructure maintenance and depreciation needs to be taking place. And if we look at what's going on right now, the Bakersfield to Merced route is $35 billion. And I know that people in the Central Valley are delighted to have those dollars coming in, but I think if they were given the option of having a $35 billion check to spend as they would like on various types of public projects.
Water storage?
Versus having, water would be very, very important. The California Policy Center has estimated that for $128 billion would be enough to retrofit Diablo Canyon's power plant, to build 2 new power plants of the same size, and to pretty much guarantee water security for California, a state, as you know, that is chronically hit with droughts and the challenges and issues that come with water rationing.
$4 billion per dam, you could build 30 dams. We only need 3 or 4. I better yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lamoff. I now recognize Ms. Wilson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Niels and Ranking Member Payne, for this important hearing. Navigating the future of intercity travel is a critical issue in my district. My community of South Florida is one of the most congested urban areas in the nation. Miami is the 8th most congested city in the world, and my neighbors are losing over 100 hours a year in bumper-to-bumper traffic. As one of the 5 co-sponsors of President Biden's landmark infrastructure bill, investing in the future of rail is critical. My district has over a half dozen railroads, including Tri-Rail and Brightline, servicing Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties. A robust intercity rail system will not only ease congestion, but also provide residents with more transportation choices. When folks take more rail, fewer cars will be on the roads, allowing residents to get to places faster, along with reducing carbon emissions. We must protect our environment. Now, when we discuss intercity rail, we must also address rail safety. I'm proud we included $5 billion in crisis funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law. We must utilize these rail safety funds to directly address rail safety in our cities to ensure we have a robust passenger rail system that includes high-speed rail that is safe for the people in the community. I call myself the champion of rail safety, and I will continue to urge for additional funding to address rail crossing improvements and other deterrents to ensure that intercity rail and citizens can coexist safely and harmoniously in our communities and stay alive. With that, I have a few questions for the witnesses. Mr. Daly, the benefits of passenger rail for mobility and the environment have been well documented. Today, we discuss both successful and less successful projects. What should communities consider when discussing a new passenger rail project to ensure success?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question. When evaluating any potential new service, you have to look at the benefits of that. Is the ridership there to support it? Clearly in your district, it appears it is. The other side is that you don't create a new problem by solving the initial one. With beginning some passenger service, if you have a pretty good ridership where you've got approximately 200 people on a train, you get 200 cars off the roads. If for some reason the proper planning is not put into place to protect the rail service in the area, where the rail service now becomes unreliable and causes additional trucks to go onto the roads, you're creating a problem worse than what you started with. One boxcar equals about 3 trucks. So protecting the level of business that you have in that area today, and also protecting the ability for those businesses to grow into the future is really critical in balancing the interest of both passenger and rail and the health of the overall line.
Okay, in my district, CSX has an operating agreement with the South Florida Regional Transportation Authority for the Tri-Rail commuter rail service. And Tri-Rail, because of that, is reporting a 25% increase in ridership this year. Can you discuss how partnerships like these with CSX have worked with local communities nationwide?
Yeah, absolutely. Our partnership with the SFRTA has been very beneficial. They've been a great partner in the region. We're excited to continue to work with them on additional opportunities, as well as the TPO in Miami has been having discussions with us as well about other opportunities that they've looked at, and we are cooperating and working with them on whatever vision they do ultimately decide on.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Watson, in your testimony, you talked about how the Texas Department of Transportation is working to address intercity rail in the Texas Triangle. In South Florida, we have private high-speed rail already connecting the state's 3 most populous counties. Can you discuss the importance of intergovernmental commitment to improving mobility and supporting local economies?
Yes, and thank you for that question. I think it's paramount, if we're going to meet the needs of the people of this country, that there be intergovernmental, be bipartisan, intergovernmental cooperation. In the Texas Department of Transportation has applied under the Corridor Planning Program for funding, grant funding, and I'm very supportive of that because I believe that will allow the local governments along these, particularly in the Texas Triangle, along those corridors, to work directly with the Texas Department of Transportation and other governmental entities to try to come up with the best way for Amtrak and others to be involved in that. There's just no way we can do this without that cooperation.
I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. I now recognize Mr. Keene for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank the witnesses for being here today. Passenger and commuter rail travel is vital for the Northeast Corridor, and specifically for New Jersey. Specifically, Amtrak and New Jersey Transit play a key role in New Jersey residents traveling to and from work and families seeing each other during holiday seasons. Additionally, federal discretionary grant programs that support intercity passenger rail travel, like CRISI program, and the Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail Grant Program provide for good jobs, increased economic viability, and safer rail travel. We must have a clear and consistent coordination between the federal government, state and local governments, and private industry to ease our supply chains, to relieve rail choke points, and make sure the passengers get to their destinations on time. This committee's goals in overseeing passenger rail travel should be safety, security, and predictability, meaning on-time departures and arrivals in a responsible manner. Finally, my bill, H.R. 1547, the One Seat Ride Act, which passed this committee in July, focuses on passenger and commuter rail. This bill would go a long way to allow 7th District residents along the Raritan Valley line of the New Jersey Transit to commute more efficiently and to travel to see family more often by rail. Mr. Daly, you mentioned in your written testimony that about 40 cents of every dollar earned in the railroad industry goes back into the upkeep of our railroads, and that the American Society of Civil Engineers gives rail infrastructure the highest grade for infrastructure conditions as compared to all other transportation modes. How does the federal discretionary grant programs help CSX maintain their lines, and how do those programs aid in CSX working with entities like state-sponsored rail lines like New Jersey Transit and Amtrak?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question, and thank you for your support on Point No Point Bridge. Yes, I mean, CSX is obviously not able to be a applicant for any sort of federal grants, but we do partner with many of the local entities or other lines that are applicants, and work with them and support them in their request for funding, which can benefit multiple parties for their requests.
Thank you. Mayor Watson, you mentioned in the first topic in your testimony that the investments in Amtrak go to improving and upgrading Amtrak's assets and fleets, but often forgotten are the other improvements Amtrak may implement with adequate funding, such as the modernization of stations, the installation of technology stations that keep passengers safe, like security cameras, and connections to other transportation services. Can you tell me how investing in Amtrak and these other federal grant programs can help improve the customer experience?
Sure, and that's a very important part of this. The fact that there's been a significant amount of money put into this program, if it's spent right and done right, will address, for example, on time, and the service that we have to demand that the trains run on time, if you will, and that's one of them. The stations, including ADA compliance, will be a very important part of how this money is spent. Upgrading those stations so that they actually provide service as opposed to just being a building where you gather before you get on a train or get off a train. Those sorts of things will make a difference and will increase the ridership.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with your sentiment and your statements. Mr. Chairman, I now yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from California, Mr. Malafar.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. Appreciate that. Dr. Ohanian, following up, did you say earlier what the speed you thought was going to be for the route from Merced to the Orchard somewhere near Bakersfield? How fast would the train be going to that route on average?
Well,
It's supposed to be 220 for the whole system, you know.
Yeah, there's a large difference between maximal speed and average speed, and of course, average speed is what's relevant for travel time. I don't know the current projected speed. What I do know is that earlier business plans seem to have over-predicted average speed by potentially a considerable amount. They were higher than any average speed that was being attained in high-speed rail systems in Europe and Japan.
Because the bond the voters were promised, a 220-mile-an-hour rail would get from SF to LA in about a little over 2 hours, and it doesn't appear attainable. Therefore, it would disqualify the bond from actually being accurate or legal.
The original estimate was 2 hours and 40 minutes. I believe the current estimate now is a little over 3 hours. That still seems quite optimistic about an average speed, and of course, average speed is fundamentally connected to how many stops will be on the route.
Thank you. I better yield back, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. To note, Mr. Daly, your on-time performance for Amtrak is over 90%. So I read that in your testimony. I said you continue to improve that. That's a very good job. Okay, now I recognize Mr. Moulton for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It is striking to me that here we are having a hearing on passenger rail in the United States, and we don't even have a single witness to talk about high-speed rail, someone who really understands high-speed rail, which just shows how behind the world we are. Japan has had a high-speed rail network since 1964. They've had 0 fatalities. I don't think we can say that about our highways or our airlines. You can travel all over Europe on high-speed rail. You can go to Paris from London for dinner and be back in time to go to bed. And yet we can't rely on Amtrak to get to New York in a couple hours. Some people refer to the Northeast Corridor as high-speed rail, but as Dr. Ohanian pointed out, what really matters is average speed, not top speed. The top speed on the Northeast Corridor is 150 miles per hour. That doesn't even qualify as high-speed rail in the rest of the world. And the average speed on the Northeast Corridor is below 100 miles per hour. Now, we're rightly celebrating what Brightline has done with private sector investment and innovation in Florida. And so far, the success has been impressive. For those of you who are skeptical as to whether people will ever ride trains, specifically high-speed rail, you might look at what's happening in Florida, where simply having new trains, faster trains, great customer service, convenience is attracting significant numbers of riders. And those trains go 110 miles per hour. 110 miles per hour. That's half the speed of trains in China. What other thing does America do that we say China can do it twice as good as we can? They can do twice as well as we. Is there anything that we just throw up our hands and say, nope, China's just literally twice as good as us? And yet that's what we're apparently doing with high-speed rail. Now, Mr. LaMalfa, a perennial critic of California high-speed rail, brought up the fact that the travel time from LA to San Francisco has gone up from 2 hours and 40 minutes to a little over 3. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that embedded in California politics and the engineering that's been made to accommodate California politics. But the bottom line is this: 3 hours is enough to get people to take the train over flying. There are countless ridership studies, but even more actual experience across the world that shows that if you can get by train somewhere in even 4 or 5 hours, you're more likely to choose it than flying. I mean, you can even look at the experience on the Northeast Corridor, where Amtrak is not exactly known for great customer service, and yet 75% of the business travel market between Washington and New York is out on Amtrak's Acela. So when you look at the Northeast Corridor, when you look at Florida, I think it's pretty hard to argue that no one's going to take this train if the high-speed rail line gets built. Now, Dr. Ohanian has said that we just can't do big infrastructure projects in America. They cost too much. Dr. Ohanian, let's just say the state of California were to embark on a project to build, well, say 4,000 lane miles of highway and 91 new airport gates. Do you think that that project would come in on time and on budget, or would you expect cost overruns for a project of that scale?
Our experience with large-scale projects typically does involve significant delays and cost overruns.
Okay, because that's what California would have to do if they don't build high-speed rail. Build 4,000 lane miles of highway and 91 new airport gates. And at the end of that, they would be able to meet 2050 travel demand. But you would not be doing anything to serve any of the cities in between LA and San Francisco. So it would solve a problem for LA and San Francisco. It would do nothing for any of the stations in between. It would do nothing to improve the traveler experience. For everyone who still chooses to drive, they would actually be going slower than they do today because adding lanes adds congestion. Instead, you could build California high-speed rail. Now, we agree that the project has been mismanaged. We agree that there have been eminent domain and environmental approval issues. We agree that we should do better than California. But you can't just say California is terrible because it hasn't been well run. You have to look at the alternatives. And we're not doing enough of that in America. Mr. Chairman, I hope we can do more of that in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moulton. I now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Burleson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ohanian, in your testimony, you write about how the California Rail is currently a failure. The project has taken, obviously, longer than expected, and it's been more expensive than originally thought. It now costs taxpayers $120 billion and basically has empty promises. That's a whopping $200 million per mile on this project. Would you say that's failed because, as it was mentioned before, there are projects, Brightspeed, private investment projects that are successful? Would you say that this is a failure because it's a government-run project?
It certainly seems that way. It's hard to reach a conclusion other than that, given 15 years of delay, given the cost overruns, given the obvious problems that plagued the system from the get-go, including a business plan that didn't identify how funding would be secured, that didn't identify a break-even point, that didn't provide expected environmental review completion dates. It was just very, very lacking. In the private sector, there's an incentive to provide a competitive return to your investors, and we can't say that's happened with California high-speed rail.
Yeah, and in order to do that, you have to provide a value to the customers who want to actually purchase the product. Do you see the demand? I mean, it's been talked about that California would need thousands of highway miles to replace the traffic. Is that demand adequate? I mean, is that accurate that people want to pay? That there's a demand? Because my thought is, if there is a demand and people want to pay for it, there's probably a private business that would be willing to step forward to make a profit.
Yeah, the very striking issue is that the private sector is incentivized to find routes where people really want the service. Government, not so much. And to get back to a couple of the statements Mr. Moulton made, at the end of the day, it's all about, can the cost come close to justifying the benefits? And the projected ridership on California high-speed rail was known by both Cato and the Reason Foundation as being far too optimistic, including ridership intensities that exceeded those in Japan, a country with much more densely populated cities and much less auto ownership. So I personally just don't see how those numbers came about. The Legislative Analyst's Office criticized this business plan for not providing the forecasting methodology. I still haven't seen the forecasting methodology provided 15 years later.
So the project is $120 billion at this time. And how many miles of rail is it?
We're now looking to build 171 miles at a cost of $35 billion between Bakersfield, which is a city of about, I believe, 400,000 people, and then Merced, which is a city of only about 90,000 people.
So compare that in the state of Missouri, the legislature just approved a $2.8 billion expenditure to add 6 lanes, or to make I-70 6 lanes all the way from St. Louis to Kansas City, 250 miles for 2.8. And this project is costing over 100?
Yes, about 50 times as much as the number you just cited.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the rest of my time to my colleague from California, Mr. Lomafo.
Thank you, Mr. Burleson. You know, if we talk about adding 4,000 lane miles in California, you could put an extra lane on I-5 both directions and on Highway 101 both directions and get a lot of traffic through there. Plus, it hits every town along the way between LA and San Francisco. So that's an interesting fact. Mrs. Mortensen, we know that under the original bond, the voters passed by a narrow majority that subsidies are disallowed for the ticket prices. Otherwise, it disqualifies the bond, and there's a lot of people in a lot of trouble. What do you expect that, with your experience with Amtrak, which I like Amtrak. I like riding the train, whether it's Baltimore to here after I fly in, or up and down on a trip we made here recently. I like the East Coast train, but it's bang for the buck, like Dr. Ohanian was saying. What's the ticket price going to have to be if it's not subsidized in order to ride California's high-speed rail? What's your experience of what Amtrak costs are?
Well, if I come at it from a private perspective, the pricing is going to be adjustable, flexible. So you would figure out peak period times where a lot of people wanted to go, and you could probably lower the pricing. You could also play a little bit with through service, and I know it sounds silly on a 171-mile corridor, but you could have through service, express service that you could charge more for. So I think it would be a flexible system with perhaps ticket prices somewhere around $40 for smaller trips or lower pricing fare windows. And it could be up to over $100 for people that might want to pay for an express trip. And I
Well,
think
those are Amtrak prices, though, for the rail, the high-speed rail, in order to have to cover its much higher costs. What do you think the ticket price would have to be for that?
it depends. Some of the models show different, what I would call underlying base costs than the Amtrak Northeast Corridor. They are projected to be lower. We could debate whether or not that comes true because a lot of things are not coming true. But under that model, you could do flexible pricing. You could do flexible train times, which are different than what are currently in the plan.
Yeah, I'm going to have to cut you off there. I'm over again, but
Got it.
there's a lot of things that we do not know that we're way off on projections, like 1 million jobs, for example, was being sold years ago. Thank you, Ms. Chairman, for your indulgence. I yield back.
Yes, sir. I now recognize Ms. Foshee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I'm happy to be here to talk about an issue that is top of mind for my district and the state of North Carolina. North Carolina's 4th is one of the fastest growing areas in the entire country. Home to world-class research universities and community colleges, vibrant small businesses, community-oriented nonprofits, and the Research Triangle Park, which is the largest research park in the nation. The Triangle region is expected to expand by nearly 80% in the next 40 years, and North Carolina has the 3rd highest population growth according to the U.S. Census Bureau. But we are struggling to keep up with the demands that come with the rapid growth in an area, and this is unfortunately reflected in our transportation infrastructure. So my first question is to you, Ms. Mortensen. You have considerable experience starting up new passenger rail service and managing legacy services. Do you have recommendations for communities like mine who are looking to expand existing service or start new service?
Well, thank you for the question. I think I would suggest really listening to the people on the ground. I'm sort of your bootstrap ground representative here. And listening to the people, and what the people say changes over time. So having an ability to sort of predict a system that can roll with how people's attitudes will change. Certainly, yes, commuting is less these days, but people are moving further away, and new people are commuting. So we're offsetting some of those commute losses. So I think listening to the ground game of the people, and then if you're operating on the Class 1 railroad, really sitting down up front. There's ways to work together. Maybe your optimal window isn't available to run a train, but maybe half an hour earlier, half an hour later. Just the flexibility, taking out some of the more high-level politics from it, trying to make sure the ground game works, and then building up the ground game.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Daly, thank you for highlighting in your testimony the good work my state, North Carolina, has done to improve intercity passenger rail service in coordination with CSX. North Carolina has also been a regional leader in working to coordinate service from the Southeast region. We are perhaps lucky to have freight rail right-of-way in the S-line that we are now looking to repurpose for intercity passenger rail. That, along with the strong support from my predecessor for federal investment in the S-line purchase. My first question to you is, how can we continue that good work? Specifically, how did you work with multiple stakeholders across Democratic and Republican governors in Virginia, and how do you see that model applying elsewhere?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. I would say North Carolina's on to a great start. You've got a very solid NCDOT there with Jason Arthur as your Director of Rail that does a great job, and we have a great relationship with him that we value very much. In addition to that, the S-line, we signed a letter of support for that application to get the funding for that purchase, and we're looking forward to continuing to work closely with NCDOT on their desires and the applications that they've made with the FRA Corridor ID program as well. One issue that we still have to overcome, and we are working on it, is one of the 4 pillars I had mentioned, the liability aspect. Something that was not able to get through the state legislature last year. I understand it's coming back up this year and seems to have much stronger support. So we're excited for that. To the second part of your question, working with different stakeholders and things like that, I think really NCDOT, our relationship with them is very much like VPRA and the Northern New England Passenger Rail Authority up in New England, where you have a strong state partner that has a true vision and the focus to get there, and the recognition that not only freight preservation, but the ability to grow, and the introduction of passenger service to do that in a way that allows both parties to be successful. Really gets across any party lines or anything else. It's looking at a problem in a feasible way and looking for the best solution for all parties, because as I mentioned previously, adding some passenger service in there in a low-cost, quick way to only have a detrimental effect on your freight business is going to create a much larger problem that's much more difficult to fix at a later time. So really going in with eyes wide open, having a strong plan and a strong partnership is the best way that I've seen.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, that's my time. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Westerman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I've been in Congress since 2015, and I think we've been talking about high-speed rail projects. Since then, there doesn't seem to be a lot of real positive progress that's being made, but I'm very intrigued with high-speed rail. Conceptually, it seems like it should work. Seems like a great solution to a lot of problems. And Mayor Watson, I've said that if we can't make it work in Texas, I don't know where you could make it work. When you look at the terrain, the topography, the population centers, it seems like almost a perfect fit. If you can make high-speed rail work, that Texas would be the place to do it. I know Florida offers a lot of those similar features. And even some of the innovations out there, like what Elon Musk had proposed, which is, I don't know if you would call it high-speed rail, but the vacuum tubes with the cars that are levitated above the rail. When you get into the details of that and look at federal regulations, it's more like airlines than it is rail in a lot of ways, with the speeds that you're talking about and all the complexities of that. We know it works other places in the world, but I want to talk about a subject that really hasn't been brought up today. There's been a lot of talk about the economics of high-speed rail. How do you make that work? The cost of high-speed rail. But when we look more broadly at infrastructure projects, we have a hard time in this country approving and building major infrastructure projects. There was a report that came out in 2015 by an organization called Common Good, where they looked at the cost of delays due to NEPA. At that time, they said a 6-year delay was costing the U.S. $3.7 trillion, that's with a T, and they attributed $1.22 trillion of that to the rail sector. So I don't know that much about this organization. I was just doing that research when we were looking at NEPA reforms in the Lower Energy Cost Act earlier, and we actually implemented some reforms that said that you could only have 2 years to do an environmental impact statement, 1 year to do an environmental assessment, or reduced the number of pages that could be in each of those from 75 to a maximum of 300. Also, during a testimony from the American Public Works Association and hearings we were having on NEPA, the president of the APWA testified that, quote, while the federal government does appropriate funds for projects like these across the country, some communities are deciding against applying for federal funds due to the onerous nature of permitting requirements, including NEPA, In my experience, anytime federal funds were introduced into a project, we immediately added at least 25% to the project budget. However, the final cost could be significantly higher than that. So we're still trying to figure out the technology and how to make these things economically viable. And maybe we can start with Mr. Daly and just go down the line. How important is permitting reform to building any kind of real project?
Yes, sir. Thank you for your question. It's not something that I'm personally very involved in. I am aware that it does cause some significant changes to initial timelines when we have them. So I'm sure I have the colleagues that are much better versed to speak to you on the matter, and we could definitely follow up with you as well.
Thank you, and I'd be happy to. I have a very painful example. We have what I call a mega project, a $400 million project ready to go out to bid, and we've gone through the NEPA and CEQA processes, we're cleared. We had a permitting issue that arose in what I would call a dry slough that hasn't had water for years, but we are struggling to make improvements so that it could be fish habitat, which is fine, making those mitigations for someday when that happens. But the project was delayed now because there needs to be a review and approval process after we're all done and ready. And where that really impacts is the back end of the project. This project, every month delay is 3%. 3% on $400 million is a lot of money. So we start racking that up because we can't move. And so any improvements in that process would be very welcomed from the ground side of things.
I'm glad you brought up this important point because in my experience, permitting delays are a huge dead weight on the U.S. economy right now. To give an example, in California, 30 years ago, developers, and this is not road and rail, but developers proposed to build a new city just outside of Los Angeles. It would be a community of about 60,000 people. California politicians on both sides say they want nothing more than more housing to reduce housing costs. 30 years later, not one house has been built. There may not be ever a house built in this new community, which is called Tejon Ranch, about 40 miles outside of Los Angeles. And it's all because of environmental delays regarding permitting. How can anyone ever take a risk to create something big when they face the very real possibility of just becoming completely bankrupted by the political permitting process? So thank you for bringing up this important point.
We're over time, but I'll be quick in answering. At the local level, we are in fact at the City of Austin going through a very detailed process to review our permitting process, because as we deal with the needs for affordable housing, we can't get in our own way. That ought to be the first rule. Government has to play a role in making sure things are safe, making sure things aren't going to have unintended consequences. And it ought to play a role in making sure that it provides the system and funds the system to make sure that the permitting can be done right. It's not just enough, I think, to say, well, permitting may be getting in the way, so let's just do away with permitting. It serves a real role, and then it's going to require government to say, let's know what our purpose is, and let's fund it well to make sure it works.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for your time and your testimony today. For decades, Americans have cried out for infrastructure policy in this country, and for decades, those cries fell on deaf ears of Congress. However, last Congress, we got our act together, and along with the vision of President Biden, we passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, which is a once-in-a-generation investment in our nation's infrastructure and competitiveness. And although my colleagues on the other side of this subcommittee, on the other side of the aisle in this subcommittee, and all but one of them on the full committee voted against the IIJA, I'm proud to see that they and their constituents are benefiting greatly from it. My state of Georgia has already begun to see the fruits of the passage of the IIJA in rail alone. The $2.5 billion in federal funding for rail projects in Georgia has enabled the expansion of healthy, sustainable transportation options. Mayor Watson, the Texas Department of Transportation has submitted 3 proposals to the FRA's Corridor ID program for segments linking the Texas Triangle of San Antonio, Houston, and Dallas. Your testimony mentions the Texas Triangle, and you discuss how developing passenger rail service there will produce robust ridership in return for relatively modest capital investment. How would this regional hub serve as a model for intercity passenger rail?
Thank you for the question. A couple of things very rapidly. One is it has a dense population and has a growing population. It is the center, if you will, of the state of Texas's economic growth and economic development. And the metropolitan areas that we're talking about are located really within about 300 miles of each other, so that it provides the ideal, if you will, of being a little bit too far to drive on congested roadways, but too short for airplane flights, and I could go into detail on that. I think it would, because of the latent demand, it would show a success, and because of the projections of what you're going to have in future demand, it would continue to grow that success.
Thank you. Could you speak to how the completion of a proposed expansion of the Amtrak Crescent route from Atlanta, Georgia to Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas, would further benefit the Triangle and in particular, the economically disadvantaged communities, both inner city and rural areas that this project would run through?
But one of the values of these projects is that it's not just for the beginning and the end. It's not just for Atlanta and just for Dallas-Fort Worth. It benefits all of those cities and communities along the way that otherwise don't have, for example, air service. They would have to go someplace else in order to get an airplane, and the cost that is involved in that. This ought to be the redundancy that would get built into something like this, not just roads and not just airports, but the redundancy of having the potential for rail would benefit a greater, I believe, would benefit a greater number of people, and in many instances, those people that otherwise might not be able to afford to travel.
Now, Dr. Ohanian does not care for the regulation of environmental impacts on economic development, but I'm sure that there are some environmental benefits that would accrue from expanding intercity passenger rail and allowing thousands of people to travel every day without needing to drive a car. Can you comment on that?
Yes, I'll make 2 brief points. One is that...
Well, that question was for Mr. Watson, but since you're in it, go ahead.
My apologies.
I thought I heard you
Go
say
ahead,
his
Professor.
name too.
Well, I just commented on the fact that the professor does not really care for costs associated with environmental regulation. But I was asking
One of the real goals that can be achieved is by reducing the amount of mobile source emissions with regard to cars, reducing the amount of need for air travel, not reducing it, but providing an alternative to those things should make a difference and will make a difference with regard to emissions that contribute to climate change.
Thank you. And I'm over my time, so I'll yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Nels and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing today. Accessible public transit is a matter of justice. It can mean the difference between getting to school on time, keeping a job, or having access to basic needs. For example, in Chicago, the IIJA helped us fund the Red Line Extension Project, which will finally connect the far south side to downtown Chicago This project was promised 50 years ago. The IIJ has helped deliver it. Cities that have previously been disconnected from other regional hubs can benefit from increased access to businesses, health care centers, and jobs if they're connected by intercity rail. Expanding passenger rail is not only an efficient and sustainable transportation choice, it's also one that can help enable economic opportunity and racial equity as well. Mayor Watson, as your testimony states, intercity passenger rail can fill a gap in regions that are only otherwise easily accessed by car. How does intercity rail bring us closer to our climate goals, and why is this especially important for the vast regions like Texas?
Congressman, I'd say two things in response to your statement. One is, as I indicated, I believe that by providing an alternative means for travel that doesn't produce additional mobile sources that we see from vehicular travel and from airplanes, you have a positive environmental impact. Second, with regard to your comment related to justice, one of the things that I would see is a real value related to having intercity passenger rail, for example, in the Triangle, is that you would allow students that need to get through community college training or otherwise to engage in career paths. They might be able to attend schools at different places, but they can't do that right now because of transportation issues that hopefully would be reduced, if not eliminated, if you had better intercity passenger rail.
Great. Thank you for that, especially the workforce emphasis. Similar to the Texas Triangle, I've been supportive of the Chicago Hub Improvement Program in my home state, which would invest $1.1 billion to revitalize Chicago rail infrastructure and connect it to surrounding states like Michigan. It would reduce a major bottleneck in Southwest Michigan and cut travel time between Chicago and Detroit as well. Mayor Watson, can you elaborate on how projects like these could benefit riders? How specifically does the Texas Triangle project plan to service previously disenfranchised communities, including low wealth and individuals with disabilities?
Certainly, I'll have two quick reactions to that. One is, as I indicated a little bit earlier, these kinds of programs don't just benefit the major city, if you will, the San Antonio, the Austin, the Dallas-Fort Worth. If you look at, for example, that leg of the Triangle, you have about 800,000 people that live in the Killeen, Temple area. And you have Waco along those ways. You have communities that it would then allow them, maybe not to live in the major metropolitan area because of cost or otherwise, but still be able to participate in those economies. The second thing that I would say about that is that careers that allow people to move from one city to another, let's say mobility and infrastructure and the construction that goes along with that, it might allow people to work in other places.
Very well. Thank you so much. And finally, my last question for Mr. Daly. As CSX is working with the Commonwealth of Virginia to build capacity for freight and passenger rail between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, your testimony mentions that the route will allow the double-stack freight trains while VRE and Amtrak simultaneously want to double the number of passenger rides along the same corridor. What is CSX doing to ensure that safety is prioritized during this increase in rail capacity and ridership?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. We are working extremely close with Virginia, VPRA, at all levels. Our engineering departments meet on a regular basis to go over the track work. Obviously, whenever there's any work going on the track, we have safeguards in place, blocking, taking tracks out of service, locking them out, whatever's necessary to provide safety to the employees performing that work. And obviously a significant amount of coordination with our partners there. Like I said, on the engineering side, operations speaks regularly. There's a executive performance management team as well that gets together regularly and talks about all the projects, report outs from from the other committees and talks about what we have going up and making sure that we can achieve our goals together.
Thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Stauber for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. In Minneapolis, the Southwest Light Rail is being considered a boondoggle of historic proportions. In 2011, the Federal Transit Administration approved the Metropolitan Council's application to pursue funding for Southwest Light Rail through a federal grant program. In that year, the council projected that the line would cost $1.25 billion and that it would begin service to the public in 2018. Since 2011, the Metropolitan Council has increased its estimate of the project's cost several times. By March of 2022, the council's projected budget for the line was approximately $2.74 billion for an opening in 2027. According to the Associated Press, this is one of the most expensive public works projects in Minnesota's history. Mr. Ohanan, passenger rail projects seem to meet shocking price challenges and massive delays across our country. What can Congress do to avoid these transportation boondoggles and more wisely invest taxpayer dollars? And what might the private sector be able to contribute to these projects?
Well, there are some data points that suggest the private sector can do this much more effectively, much more efficiently, much more quickly. For example, based on Brightline's project in California. So that appears to have some potential and promise for you to consider as stewards of federal funding for these types of projects. Honestly, acknowledging risk is so fundamentally important because, as you noted, these projects historically are substantially delayed. They have substantial cost overruns. And I suspect that if we do require these projects to provide a plan based on realistic risk assessments, I think a lot of them just won't pencil out in terms of costs and benefits. And obviously you need to prioritize a wide number of projects, and that can be important information to you in your decision-making process.
Thank you. Prior to me entering Congress, I was a police officer for 23 years, and I want to talk about crime. In November 2022 article from the American Experiment states that the Metro Transit Light Rail system in Minneapolis has consistently operated as one of the most dangerous light rail systems in the country since 2014. According to the Federal Transit Authority, 40% of all personal security events that occurred on America's 22 light rail systems in 2019 happened on Metro Transit. Mr. Daly, in your opinion, what makes passenger rail so vulnerable to crime, and what has CSX done to improve the safety?
Yes, sir. Thank you for your question. CSX is a robust PSCC department that works actively with local and state officials in the safety and our yards, our trains, our tracks. I know they also coordinate very closely with Amtrak and their own police department and the activities that they partake in their stations and on their trains. As far as the Amtrak or passenger side, how they handle the safety is something that probably a better question for them. I'm not particularly.
But from your experience, like why do you think it's so vulnerable to crime?
It's a fair question. I mean, some of the stations are in isolated areas. Some of them may not be as well lit as, say out clearly an airport, but other modes of transportation. There's not particularly the security of TSA onboarding onto passenger trains. So I'm sure that's a factor that plays in as well.
So in your opinion, do you think there needs to be more law enforcement presence?
I can't think of a situation where safety wouldn't be improved with additional law enforcement presence.
You can't think of a situation?
Where additional presence of law enforcement would not equal into more safety.
Mr. Daly, I want to be sure that I heard you right, and I may have misunderstood me. Are you saying that more law enforcement presence wouldn't make crime decrease?
No, sir,
I misunderstood you then, okay.
Additional law enforcement presence would equal into additional safety.
That's right.
Yes, sir.
I appreciate that question because I agree with you very much. Mr. Chair, I see my time's up. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize my good friend out of California, Mr. DeSaulnier, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I really want to start my comments, as I've told you personally. Mr. LaMalfa, thank you for taking us down memory lane when we both voted the same way on authorizing the funding for high-speed rail. The second time, I was the only Democrat in the legislature, even though I chaired the committee. But to this, I think there's a real opportunity to have the right mix. So the proper federal oversight for projects like that and others. And Ms. Mortensen, I want to start with you because I have so much history with your project, starting in local government when my party affiliation was different many years ago. And we were working with the Bay Area with 7.5 million people and the 10 counties that surrounded it that were becoming this mega region that, to your point, is very geographically challenged in terms of access. So we worked well with multiple counties, multiple transportation entities, local government, the state, and private sector. So you've got the 4th busiest port in the United States, one of the busiest export ports for agriculture. All of that worked, but it took a lot of work. But we still had proper oversight and shared risk with pretty good modeling, both for the freight side and the commercial side, even though the dynamics of that corridor were changing so dramatically as Silicon Valley all of a sudden appeared. And we had the opportunity for the private sector actually to fund the Dunbarton Bridge all the way across there. So speak about, just briefly, because I really want to talk to the other Californian on the panel, about cost and being realistic about it and not apples to apples, not apples to oranges. To speak a little bit about our experience, land use, transportation funding, Prop 13, all of those conspired to make your project so difficult, but also how it interconnects to the Valley and prospectively to Los Angeles.
Well, I think interconnection is a key word. We're not just looking at a transportation mode, a line on a map. So it's interconnected with land use visions for each of the communities. And what is done in San Francisco and Oakland and San Jose may be different than what's done in Stockton and Manteca and Modesto. But we fought, and it got very hard, but we stayed with it. And so I think while we end up with bruises at the end, we come out with a product that the people can trust. And sometimes I think today we get to where it's really hard, and then there's a faction that wants to kill something, there's a faction that wants to throw their hands up. But I think staying with it across different perspectives and really fighting to get it done, you'll get the best product at the end because you have the view of both sides and many angles. And I'll stop there so you can.
And in your case, we went through the existing cumbersome process.
We did.
But we had to work with multiple MPOs.
We did.
And local government and the state transportation agencies. And when you throw cap and trade in there, you had to deal with the air regulators, but we did it. Dr. O'Hanian, I really appreciate your comments, but I would hope you would agree that just going to public-private doesn't solve the problem either. We've got plenty of examples around the country and the world. First big project of then Governor Schwarzenegger was Doyle Drive in San Francisco, which proportionately was as bad a project, but it was that idea that public-private will save the world. As you know in your studies, getting the risk associated, whether it's a fully funded public project or a public-private partnership around the world, and we have examples in South America where public-private partnerships were awful, getting that risk assessment is so important. So could you speak a little bit to that? Brightline may work, but if it's public-private, it could be a disaster as well, if the contractual relationships aren't thoughtful.
Yes, my comments were to indicate that various kinds of models could be used to create high-speed rail. Their cost numbers look very favorable right now. Of course, they seem to be ready to break ground soon, so we'll have to see how that plays out. A separate issue is that America is just a very high-cost producer of railway, whether it's high-speed rail or subway systems. I looked at some data that compared costs across countries for high-speed rail, and France and Germany are doing it about half the cost that we are. And I hope that at some point we can get to the bottom of why our cost differences are so big. Secretary Buttigieg noted this 2 years ago.
Doctor, excuse me, because I only have limited time, and I'd love to continue this conversation. Some of that is a function of cultural, but it's also how they are subsidized. I mean, the best model that I've seen in the world, and I've been all over the world looking at this, is in Japan. But both culturally and density and how the funding is, and the mayor will understand this, every state being different, all of that's different. So we had to do our model for high-speed rail in California to begin with to compete with Southwest from LA to San Francisco. That's subsidized too. So, Mr. Chairman, I will stop there. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'd love to continue the conversation because I think there's a real opportunity here to get this right. Texas is searching. We need to have rail. We need to have rail, passenger rail and freight rail. We'd have to have better accountability, and that should be nonpartisan.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Williams for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I direct my first question, Mr. Daly. CSX has made a bid in Virginia and an investment in Virginia. Can you describe some of the metrics that were used to identify that as a attractive venture? I'm trying to get what are the building blocks of that kind of decision?
Yeah, I mean, it was a request that came from Virginia, who we've been in partnership with for decades. Ever since we started, many years before my tenure, there has been a continued growth and desire for additional passenger services. So it's something that's been discussed ongoing for many years. We performed many studies over the years to evaluate the potential to introduce additional passenger services, and we had a pinch point there with the bridge. The Long Bridge was at capacity, running at 98% prior to this agreement that we entered into, which is going to build an additional bridge across the Potomac to allow for additional passenger services. So once we really put together a full vision plan for how this looks for the next 30, 40 years is when, we were able to put all the pieces together to not only validate the additional services, but also the investment for the bridge and property acquisitions and additional trackage rights as well.
And the property acquisitions were, fairly small compared to like California that's has to get an entire new, or Texas even, that has to get an entire new right away. Is that right?
That's correct, yes, sir.
Okay. And in terms of your study, do you know some of the key metrics that, the go, no-go decisions there?
The RTC study that was performed previously on the bridge was just looking at throughput initially. Studies we have done since then, as we started working through the planning process, looked at the current level of on-time performance, future growth of the freight network in the area, and the impacts of adding in the additional passenger trains, looking at delay metrics primarily.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to understand why the East Coast seems to have figured out the secrets to rail, even something like Brightline, where there, were tracks, but not necessarily, a culture of rail traffic, at least not in the last 50, 60 years, not that much. Expanding in Virginia, we have Amtrak, where I live upstate, gets the Empire Line. And I've actually lived all over the country, so I know the California geography and the Texas geography quite well. And I'm wondering, what are the metrics for success that get evaluated in the Virginia case, and what are those in, for example, the California or the Texas case? And why is there such a discrepancy between what seems like a pretty viable culture of rail on the East Coast, and yet it seems very difficult to replicate anywhere else? It's a sincere question. There's no political gotchas at the end of it. I'm actually trying to understand what are the metrics for success and trying to use Virginia. So we just have a short amount of time, but if any of you can throw out any ideas, I'd appreciate it.
I think California is a bit the Wild West. We really overemphasize the car, probably more so than any state. And we're paying some of the consequences of that. Not that we don't need highways, we do. We've got multiple ports, we have goods movement all over the place. At some point, that may be all the highways carry because we have that much goods movement. But I can say from my own personal example, it does feel harder in California. It does feel like there's delays that come up at the last minute that can't be predicted. And I think we have to look at the root model of what's causing those issues before we start the projects. Perhaps we haven't done that as well in the past as we should.
Well, it seems like politics is big. The fact that BART doesn't connect to Caltrain is a disaster, and it was a decision made in the, 70s or whatever. Any other thoughts?
I think that we're going to learn, we ought to be learning from Virginia and North Carolina and some of the things that are happening there. And some of the metrics that we'll see there is population, the density of that population, the potential growth of that population, demographics, and the economy, and how, in the case of intercity passenger rail, like we're talking about in the Texas Triangle, how near those entities are so that people are incentivized to use that because their alternatives are not that great, either be on a congested roadway or a very short flight that costs a lot of money.
I've driven them all and also appreciate Southwest Airlines. One last quick question is $128 billion, it looks like, in the California project. Do you think Texas could build that railway for less than $128 billion? Anybody?
I certainly think they could.
I think so too. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Hey, I'd like to thank the panel. I know we're approaching 2 hours here. I think this has been just a wonderful conversation. I think a lot of great points have been made, either from the questions that have been asked by this panel. But we have a few members here who'd like to go to a second round. Do you feel that you could hang out for another 10, 15 minutes so we can finish this? I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the panel for obliging us. It's just one question I have for Ms. Mortensen. Congressional Republicans have proposed cutting funding to Amtrak's national network by nearly 35%. There was even an amendment 2 weeks ago to eliminate national network funding. What impact would that have on your San Joaquin's Amtrak route?
Well, I'll answer it a couple ways. California funds the entirety of their services. So we pay 100% of the Capital Corridor, Los Angeles Corridor, and San Joaquin's. What I'm hopeful of is it's sparring, positioning to sort of get to the right-sized allocation, and that it sorts itself out. Because I think operating funding that is predicted and relied upon needs to be maintained. And so I'm hopeful this is the moves on the chessboard that get to that allocation that's necessary for operations. And I do think Amtrak's IIJA process, while I didn't always agree with their tactics, they did get a lot of public input, and so the public is built into some of those capital project expectations. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. LaMalfa.
I'm back. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Mortensen, what is the highest speed conventional Amtrak train? Is it 120 miles an hour if they're on the highest grade track?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, I did some math on that. It's a little rough, but for the segment we're talking about from Merced to an almond orchard near Bakersfield, about 165 miles. So I had it that if, given estimates of real world speed for high-speed rail in the area, maybe being around 150 miles an hour versus a 120 mile an hour Amtrak on its own rails, you would save 16 minutes. So I have to wonder what the value is for the amount of investment just in that, segment there of $35 billion. Now, if you manage to run it at 220 miles per hour, it could be down as low as 45 minutes, but it doesn't sound like 220 is practical. So is it practical to have more 120 mile an hour Amtrak trains if we did more, eliminated a few more at-grade crossings, more over crossings, and and upgrade the tracks we need to, probably for a fraction of the price.
It does, and it could. The issue of safety has been brought up, and one of the real benefits for the forever future is a dedicated corridor that gets rid of the at-grade crossings. And so I know we can't always achieve the ideal, but I think that is the ideal more from a safety standpoint. I think the reality of that first segment is that the train sets will be geared towards a max speed of 150, but the average speed, as has been mentioned, would probably be down closer to 130
For the high speed.
for that initial segment.
Yeah, so you're really not achieving a heck of a lot more than what Amtrak conventional is available. But let me jump to Dr. Ohanian. We go from what we saw in 2008, a $33 billion project for SF all the way to LA. And what we're getting right now seems to be $35 billion for about 1/4, maybe 1/3 of that. Do you think the voters would approve a $35 billion Merced to an Orchard near Bakersfield project?
I don't believe so. I don't see how that would be practical for most voters. It wouldn't be a wise use of public investment.
And there doesn't appear to be a plan to get through the Bay Area. I think they're going to have to link to existing project to go from San Francisco to South San Jose, which is, they're not going to have high speed, it appears. And getting into LA, as we mentioned earlier about the Grapevine, how they can even get it into LA. So it's not going to fulfill the goal for anywhere near the price. Can the voters ask for a refund for that $9 billion bond?
That's
a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
I won't make
voters. I agree. Voters need some answers.
But so much success with Brightline, or what appears to be with the Gambler Special to Vegas, or in a couple other locations. So, what model is Brightline bringing that is not bringing investors or anybody for, again, we have $9 billion for California from the bond, $3.5 billion from the ERA funding back in the stimulus package of 2009, I say, it's 14 years ago. And then they've been able to come up with carbon taxes and auctions and get $1 billion here, $1 billion there. So they're going to maybe come up with $20 billion out of the $128 billion, unless they come begging more for here. What broke down with the California model versus what Brightline can do with the Gambler Special to Vegas or the other locations we're talking about?
Well, I think Brightline was very prescient in being able to build low cost because in terms of the land they were able to acquire. That's been different relative to other systems where there's disputes, eminent domain issues come up over acquiring private land. And kudos to Brightline, assuming that it comes together as we all hope. They were able to identify a route with substantial demand and be able to look like build it at a very, very low cost. And both of those aspects on the demand side and the cost side, those are things we want to see.
Yep.
And as you face a long laundry list of infrastructure and transportation projects, I know you're concerned about making sure that the funding goes to where it should in terms of high rates of return. I wish I had better things to say about my home state.
Well, me too. I better stop there, but thank you. We heard earlier, though, the assertion that if China can do it, why can't the U.S.? Well, China, when they built the Three Gorges Dam, they just built it. They didn't ask permission. They didn't get permits. And the people that lived in the flood space were told, well, I guess you better move. Same thing. Can you imagine taking a couple of D11s and going from here up to Boston to try and make a wider track? You don't get to do that here. You have to go through permits. You have to, be respectful of property rights and all that. We don't get just to pound through in this country, so China's not much of a model. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
I now recognize Mr. DeSaunier go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, this really is sort of interesting. So I want to go back to real examples. I think this idea that having proper oversight at a federal level and incentivizing good performance in terms of risk assessment, but you've got to, everything's different. Brightline, what's so significant for Brightline, I support the idea, is Doctor, as you mentioned, is the right-of-way. It's there, it's largely existing, and the modeling for the Inland Empire, there's been huge land use growth there. So we can use regional, like we do with the valley, to get people out to these new exurbs. So it's just being consistent in getting the right modeling. It's not saying, and looking at high-speed rail in California and other examples, including public-private projects that didn't work. So I understand that this is a political poster child, perhaps. If we had gone down Highway Interstate 5, as originally proposed with high-speed rail, the cost assessments would have been very different, would they not, Dr. O'Hine? If we look back and look at Brightline now and the cost driver in terms of right-of-way and look at going down Interstate 5 30 years ago, which was the original proposal, it would be a very different cost benefit, would it not?
Very, very possible. Acquiring private land has proven to be just a real bugaboo in these types of projects. So as you consider these types of proposals, that's an important component to be very wary of.
And if you look at the Japanese model, their JR lines, they start with the spine from Tokyo to Okinawa, and then they go out. We could have done the same thing in California. We could have gone down Highway 5 and then gone out. The bigger challenge, as I understand it in history, talking to people who've done these projects, is the Tehachapi's at that rate. To do 220 miles an hour on average through the whole system was not an engineering feat that anyone else had done at that grade. Is that your understanding, Doctor?
That's my understanding, and I believe there's still significant seismic tunneling and viaduct issues to consider in the system. And at the end of the day, as an economist, I want to give you the best advice possible, and it boils down to do the benefits warrant the costs involved? And if they do, that's terrific. And if they don't, then we should honestly assess that and consider alternative projects that have a lot of merit.
So we've got this investment where it is. I've got good friends who administer high-speed rail who I disagree with, and people on that board. How best to take that investment and still use it? And so Mr. LaMalfa mentioned this. Getting into the Bay Area now is where they've pivoted to. Is we've got population decline right now in California because of the cost of housing and because some of our businesses are moving to the mayor's jurisdiction, and now you're having some of the same issues we have. But learning from the past and still getting the vision that we want is something that I think is very doable. Mr. Mortensen, you're an example of that investment potentially still being used to create the larger statewide investment.
Yeah, I think the decision point will be coming soon, where people will have to talk about what do we do with what we have right now, and how do we make the best of it? And we get a bit of a restart to sit down with the partners again. The original vision that got sort of politically shifted is now difficult to achieve, but what can we achieve that makes sense for the people that we're trying to serve right now? And I think dialogues like we talked about, that's the way forward with the railroads, with the third-party experts who know how difficult these things are on the ground, and then with our state and federal funding partners.
And lastly, the fiscal model's changed because the cost to take the shuttle, whether it's Southwest or United or Alaska, has also risen. Right. So if you went back and looked at that, I just want to finish with the mayor, because it's having come from local government. We talked about telecommuting. In San Francisco, we've got a 40% vacancy rate. People from my district are not, if they're software engineers, they're staying at home. It's a good thing. But we've got lots of old government agencies in your area and our area that don't work very well. So this is an example. Could you speak to that in Austin just for a minute or a few seconds, whatever the chair will allow?
Sure. First of all, we're seeing a number of people. Yes, you're seeing more remote working, and I think some of that remote working is there to stay, but I don't think it's as dire as some see, and if dire is the right word, I mean, I think it's not as extreme as some people see it. And certainly that's not been our case, including with our downtown, for example. I think in areas that are growing, even if they're doing more remote working, you're still seeing the need for people to be able to get from one place to another, and that demand is there. I think that demand, otherwise you wouldn't have congested roadways. Right. Otherwise you wouldn't have the airlines doing the way they're doing. And so we have to address that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been a great hearing.
Yes, sir. The gentleman yields. We have one other member just arrived, Mr. Duarte. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
First of all, Ms. Mortensen, good to see you here in D.C. Thank you for your time spent back in near the district in your Stockton office. Tell me, one dialogue we've had here in this committee, in this subcommittee over the year, has been, what are the Transportation Infrastructure Job Act requirements insofar as carbon neutral, social justice, diversity, equity, inclusion, American sourcing, doing to our ability to spend that money in a way that gives American taxpayers a bang for their buck? A lot of these things load costs in that may or not be optimal.
Well, coming from the ground game, as I've discussed, when there's something built into legislation, either state or federal, the language is somewhat generic and oriented towards gains. But when we get down to the project level and we want to talk about which specific emissions, because they're tackled in different ways, and which particular areas that are disadvantaged, because those are tackled in a different way. So there's not a monolith approach, not a one-size-fits-all approach to driving these goals down into the projects. And so we get there and we're not clear, and then the reviewing agencies are not clear. And so we can't know if we're doing it right. And so I think a better establishing of expectations that are clear, that can be driven down into communities and contractors is needed. And I feel like we have a gap in the middle right now.
So do you think you're losing time? Like, does a one-year project become a two-year project, or what does that do to your timing?
Well, in this particular day and age, with inflation the way it is and cost risk that's now being applied by contractors, every month you delay has a sizable impact on the project. And so you get 12 months in a row. 1 year could be a staggering difference on project cost in this environment.
Thank you. Dr. Ohanian, I really enjoyed your notes. I'm from California, and a big part of my district has the high-speed rail through it. And I'm not a supporter of high-speed rail. I've seen it go over budget. I've seen it fail to perform. I've seen it for 30 years now be a bit of a pipe dream. One aspect of it I haven't seen studied that I'd like to see if you have information on is, what is the carbon impact of construction of the high-speed rail alone? And has anybody studied what the ridership assumptions would have to be so that we end up net carbon neutral or better by constructing the high-speed rail versus driving on highways and building the highways we need?
Right, so building high-speed rail requires cement and concrete, which is carbon intensive, and so that's a net negative. Off the top of my head, I don't know the break-even point, but what I do recall is that California's contribution to global carbon emissions is less than 1%. High-speed rail would reduce carbon emissions in terms of moving people out of cars or airplanes and into high-speed rail by about 1.5%. So you're looking at 1.5% of 1%. It's not really moving the needle.
And does your 1.5%, I'm sorry, does your 1.5% estimation include the construction load in carbon emissions? That's only the operating.
That's just the operating.
So we're building a $128 billion carbon emissions laden project to save 1.5% of 1% of global carbon emissions.
That's correct.
And that would take a long time to offset if there were substantial carbon emissions in the construction alone.
Yes, it would. And of course, high-speed rail was planned when the world was a very different place before California would only be selling electric cars by the year 2035. That was never taken into account in the planning as well, and that would make the project somewhat less desirable.
So would anyone that contends that California high-speed rail is a project that will lead to lower carbon emissions, net of its construction load, be fantasizing?
Based on the information I have and the statistics I've seen, I just don't see it as moving the needle whatsoever.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Before we conclude, I'd like to point out that in your testimony, Mr. Daly, it says CSX average moving 1 ton of freight, 537 miles on a single gallon of fuel. I think that's important to know, which is 3 to 4 times more fuel efficient than moving 1 ton of freight by truck. I think that's fantastic. Listen, I don't think there's any other members on this committee that have any questions. Seeing none, this concludes our hearing for today. I want to thank all of our our witnesses for being here. Your testimony was very insightful. The committee stands adjourned.